way to pay for the troops in Saudi Arabia was to cut the farm aid.
It was inconceivable to me that in the 21st century that someone is getting frostbite in their own home.
How did something like that happen? And how do we give oil that much power over our lives?
Why isn't anyone in Washington talking about this?
It probably will be viewed as the worst disaster on American soil ever.
Friends, pray with me for the well-being of every man, woman, and child.
By the summer of 2005, American reliance on oil was at an all-time high. We were the world's #1 consumer, burning a quarter of all the oil produced globally. There were 2 cars for every household. There was even an oil man in the White House. For decades, experts had warned of the day when the supply would run out. But no one expected that day to arrive so soon. Off the coast of Louisiana, a Category 4 storm was brewing.
Labor Day weekend, but out in the Gulf of Mexico, Hurricane Julia continues to build, and the experts are telling the people of New Orleans to think about evacuating the city.
Joining us is Frank Milner. He is the Director of Emergency Management right here in Jefferson Parish. And Frank, what do you say to the folks who have not yet evacuated?
Get out while you can. Julia is a Category 4 hurricane. This city is 13 feet below sea level and surrounded by water on 3 sides. If New Orleans takes a direct hit, we're going to be the next Atlantis.
While the nation worried about the threat posed to the people of New Orleans, the fears of those in the oil industry were focused on a few acres of marshland 60 miles further south. Before Hurricane Julia, most people had never even heard of Port Fourchon, but it was the vital hub of American oil supply, providing more than 15% of the 20 million barrels of oil consumed each day. The port's director of operations, John Hamill, knew he had little margin for error.
We didn't know for sure that the hurricane was going to hit us, but after Hurricane Ivan, I wasn't going to take any chances. My priority was to get the oil workers the hell out of there. Of course, the evacuation process would save the men, but it wouldn't protect the billions and billions of dollars of oil and the drilling infrastructure out there in the Gulf of Mexico. We extract 1 million barrels of oil on the rigs supported by the port. That's the bulk of deep water gas and oil production out in the Gulf. And then on top of that, over 1 million barrels of imported oil comes through the port. That's 13% of the nation's oil imports.
The majority of these foreign imports flowed through the essential Loop pipeline. It surfaced from the Gulf right outside John Hamill's office.
It is a pipeline that runs on the ocean floor, goes out 18 miles into the Gulf, into approximately 120 feet of water. Super tankers, ships pull up from all over the place, attach into it, and then we process it through Port Fourchon. And from there it's distributed domestically to 30% of the pipelines out into the United States of America. 1 million barrels a day.
That evening, government officials met to discuss emergency management plans for New Orleans and Port Fourchon should Hurricane Julia strike. Representing the Department of Energy was Undersecretary Jack Roden.
We had been following Julia for several days. It had avoided Key West and gone between the narrow straits between Key West and Cuba. So it was time to really be concerned about it. I knew that if the port were devastated, that it would blow a hole in the American economy and that it would affect the livelihoods of everyone in the nation.
Forecasters are warning that it's only a matter of hours now before Hurricane Julia strikes the city of New Orleans.
By Saturday afternoon, authorities declared a full-scale state of emergency for Louisiana.
Over 1 million people have been on the move on many of the highways out of New Orleans. It's absolute gridlock.
Cars blocked highways, with people desperate to escape the coming storm.
Now, the mayor is concerned about the 100,000 or so who are not leaving. We have over 100,000 residents that rely upon public transportation to get around the city, so they really do not have any means to leave our city. So we will have people in the city that will ride the storm out.
Just a short while ago, they opened up the Superdome as what they refer to a shelter of last resort.
I live only a few miles away from here. I was born and raised here. I wasn't sure that my people or the people who live down here would actually make it. I knew that potentially tens of thousands of people were going to die.
At 6 a.m., Hurricane Julia made landfall, directly hitting Port Fourchon. Slowly inland, Julia tore apart vast areas of southern Louisiana.
Devastating scenes are being reported in hurricane-stricken New Orleans. Hundreds are feared dead, with emergency services unable to cope.
Phone lines are down in many areas, so if you're stuck in a building and you
Although the city itself was spared the full force of the hurricane, parishes surrounding New Orleans were devastated.
It's never going to be the same again. Many people were lost. And you can't retrieve lives.
In Louisiana, 1,476 people would die at the hands of Julia. But the oil crisis that followed would claim tens of thousands more lives in the months to come. That Labor Day weekend, with lines of communication cut off, government officials had no way of knowing the extent of the damage. Everyone was desperate for information.
I wanted to give the Secretary of Energy and the President of the United States the best possible advice I could give. But my advice and my counsel was dependent on information from Port Fourchon.
As soon as the eye of the storm passed, I was back at the port assessing the damage. The port was an absolute mess. The entire platforms had simply disappeared.